They marked it as failure, the hesitation, the pause, the silence. They thought you slipped, lost focus, got weak. They watched you go quiet and mistook it for defeat. Because they only understand movement when it makes noise. They only respect power when it shouts. And you never played by that rule book. You were never falling. You were calculating. While they celebrated your absence, you were clearing the field, letting the dust settle, watching, learning, moving, just not loud enough for them to notice. You didn't stumble, you shifted. And they're just now realizing how deep that move went. They replay the timeline, trying to pinpoint the moment you broke, but there was no break. Just a silence they weren't trained to read. Because people like them feed on reaction. They thrive on response. But you didn't give them that. You starved them, let them drown in their own noise while you disappeared under it. And now, they look up, and you're not where they left you. You're not broken. You're rebuilt. Sharper, colder, untouchable, and they hate it. Not because you changed, but because you changed without their permission. You never slipped. You stepped aside so you could return with precision. They kept watching the wrong things, looking for weakness in noise, not movement. They studied your silence like it was absence, never realizing it was camouflage. You didn't pause. You repositioned. And that's the difference between you and them. They chase attention. You chase angles. While they filled rooms with talk, you were mapping exits. While they mocked your stillness, you were building new ground under their feet. And now they're starting to feel it, that discomfort, that pressure, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but arrives fully formed. You were never out of the game. You just changed the rules while they were celebrating too early. They post louder now, laugh harder. Their confidence has cracks in it, hairline fractures they try to hide with noise. Because somewhere deep down they sense it, that shift in the air, that silence that isn't soft, it's tactical. They feel watched, but no one's there. They feel judged, but no one's speaking. You didn't return, you just stopped hiding. And they're realizing something they should have known from the beginning. Real movement doesn't echo, it lands. They started noticing the quiet gaps, not in the world, in themselves. The confidence they once wore like armor doesn't fit the same anymore. Something's off, and they can't name it. They talk like nothing changed, but they move like they're being watched. Because they are, just not in the way they understand. You didn't come back, you let the silence come forward. It stretches ahead of you now like a shadow they can't step out of. You're not speaking, but the weight of your stillness bends the room. Every time they enter, they scan for something they can't explain. They call it energy, vibe, whatever helps them sleep. But what it really is consequence. They thought they had time, that your quiet was a delay, a break. They didn't realize it was positioning. And now their own movements feel smaller, less sure. Their words land flat. Their performance feels exposed. Because once you've moved without noise, anything loud starts to look desperate. You didn't disappear to reflect. You disappeared to restructure. And while they were busy tracking reactions, you were stripping emotion out of the equation, not colder, clearer, You didn't stop caring, you stopped wasting. Now even in their wins, there's a silence, a pause after every laugh, a look over the shoulder, because they're starting to feel it, not the loss, the gap you left behind. And the worst part, they know it wasn't an accident. You left like that on purpose. They don't say your name anymore, not because they forgot, but because it carries weight now. Saying it out loud feels like admitting something they've tried to bury, that you didn't break. You vanished on purpose. You didn't go silent because you were weak. You went silent because you knew noise was beneath you. And now, that silence has grown teeth. It chews at them when they're alone. When the room gets too quiet, your absence starts to breathe, not with sound, but with presence. They check their mirrors longer, scroll slower. There's tension in their stillness now, and it's not theirs, it's yours. You left, but the silence stayed behind, and it's not done talking. They thought they had you figured out, that you moved on because you couldn't face them, that you stopped responding because you didn't know what to say. But it was never that. You had all the words. You just decided none of them were worth using, so you left the most effective message of all: nothing. Now they're performing for ghosts, your ghost, trying to prove something to someone who's already gone. They dress sharper, speak louder, argue with shadows, but no matter what they do, the story hasn't changed. You didn't lose, you didn't run, you just moved in a direction they couldn't follow because it didn't make noise, and every time they look back trying to understand what they missed, they come up against the same truth. You were already gone. Long before they realized you were leaving, they built a version of you in their heads, weak, confused, unfinished, a story that made your absence easier to swallow. You were the one who disappeared, so you must have been broken. You must have given up. That's how they made sense of it. That's how they kept themselves comfortable. But the truth doesn't care about comfort. You didn't disappear. You removed yourself, quietly, surgically, without mess, without drama. You didn't lose control, you reclaimed it. And now the version of you they invented is cracking, doesn't line up with reality. Because you didn't fade, you evolved. You became sharper in silence, less visible, more dangerous. You're not hiding, you're just done performing. And what scares them most isn't where you are now. It's what else you saw before you left, the things you noticed, the people you stopped speaking to, the words you never said because they were never worth the noise. Now they feel the shift. It's not loud, it's not fast, but it's undeniable. Something is moving, something they can't touch, can't explain, can't stop. And every time they feel that cold presence return, on a screen, in a room, in a sentence not spoken, they realize it. You never slipped, you stepped out of reach. If you're still here, they never had you. Subscribe and stay silent. They're trying to rewrite the timeline now. Reframe what happened. You ghosted. You cracked. You couldn't handle it. Because if they say it enough, maybe it'll feel true. But deep down, something doesn't fit. Their version of the story keeps slipping. There's a chill that won't leave the room, a detail they missed, a step they didn't see. Because while they were watching for noise, you were moving through shadows. Clean, controlled, methodical. You didn't need to announce anything. You didn't need to prove anything. The proof is in how they're still reacting to a presence that isn't there anymore. You stopped responding, but they never stopped performing. Now they're guessing, trying to reverse engineer your silence. They replay every message, every moment, every pause, hoping to find something they can weaponize. But all they find is absence. And absence can't be debated. It can't be reshaped. It just is, and it's louder than any excuse. They underestimated you not because you were quiet, but because they were loud. They thought the one who speaks last wins. You knew better. You knew the real victory is walking away so clean they can't even stain your name without staining themselves. And now, your silence isn't just an absence, it's a mirror, and they hate what it shows. By now, your silence has taken on a shape of its own. It has a rhythm, a weight, a presence that bends everything around it. They can't post, speak, or even think without brushing against it. The more they try to ignore it, the more it frames everything they do. And the worst part, you're still not saying anything. You don't need to. The silence is speaking for you. It wraps around their conversations. It lives in the pauses between their sentences. Every joke lands flatter. Every boast feels forced. Because no matter how much noise they make, they're still echoing inside a space you left behind. They've filled the room with words, but none of it feels like power, just noise flailing in absence. They scroll through your name, check your presence, try to guess what you're thinking, but it's not about what you think. It's about what you already decided. You're not lost, you're not confused, you're done. And they can't stand how calm that looks from the outside, because it means they weren't the ending. They were the distraction before the upgrade. Now everything feels artificial to them, performative, because once they've felt your silence, real, intact, untouchable, everything else feels scripted. No one else stares without reacting. No one else walks away without leaving a trail. No one else leaves them talking to shadows like you did. And maybe they won't admit it, but they finally understand what happened. You didn't lose your voice. You just made sure it would echo without ever speaking. They keep checking for signs, a post, a word, a glance, anything to suggest you're still watching. But you're not really. You've already moved beyond it, past the room, past the noise, past them. What's left behind isn't attention, it's residue, a trace of silence so sharp it cuts deeper than presence ever could. And that's what they can't handle. You're no longer in the game, but they're still playing against you. They craft replies you'll never read, arguments you'll never hear, victories aimed at an audience that doesn't include you, and still, none of it feels complete, because the person they're trying to outperform, the one they build every move around, isn't even watching. You're not in the arena. You dismantled the arena and walked away without a scratch. Now their wins feel hollow. Their voices ring back at them, empty. They used to crave your attention. Now they fear your silence. Because it's not passive, it's permanent. You didn't go quiet to regroup. You went quiet to remove, cleanly, entirely. And the absence you left doesn't feel temporary. It feels like judgment. They've built a reality where you still matter, because they can't face the version where you don't. But that version, it's the only one you recognize now. They weren't your mistake. They were just noise, and you moved through it like a shadow with a purpose. They built systems after you left, rules, boundaries, new lines drawn in panic, but none of it sticks. Because no matter what they say, what they set, what they swear they've learned, you're still the measure, not of what went wrong, but of what was real. You didn't need to raise your voice to leave a scar. You just had to vanish without warning. Now every connection they chase is weighed against your silence, not your presence, your absence. They look for the same stillness in others, the same lack of need, the same sharp calm that you wore like armor, but it's never there, because copies mimic noise. Originals master quiet. They tried to label you, detached, disloyal, difficult, but what they really meant was unreachable, unshakable, unrepeatable, and that truth stings in ways they can't explain. Because if you were a mistake, they could move on. If you were a failure, they could outgrow you. But you weren't either. You were clarity, a version of reality they couldn't manipulate. And that's what broke them. Not your silence, the fact that it wasn't negotiable. They still think about what they could have said, what they should have done. They imagine conversations that never happened and never will, not because you're punishing them, but because you've erased the option of being reached. And that's what silence does when it's used right. It doesn't wait. It ends. They don't look for you anymore, not because they've moved on, but because they know, deep down, you're not coming back, not physically, not emotionally, not even in memory. You didn't just leave the room, you rewrote the exit. No open door, no echo, just the quiet void left behind by someone who never intended to return. And they feel that now, not like pain. Pain fades. This doesn't. It lingers. It settles into the bones of every new connection, every forced smile, every fake laugh. Because your silence didn't end the story, it ended their place in it. They talk about growth, about closure, but all of it rings false. Because real closure doesn't come from understanding, it comes from erasure. And you didn't walk away with questions. You walked away with everything you needed and left nothing behind. They still rehearse lines, things they'd say if they saw you again. But there's no again. There's no scene waiting to be played. You didn't pause the movie, you broke the screen, and now all they have is reflection, not on what they lost, but on what they never really held. You were never falling, you were never stuck, you were just moving, without noise, without warning, without need. And that's the difference. They talk to be heard, you disappeared to be final.